Hi, and welcome to Module 3 on How Can I Support My Learners with ADHD? A child with ADHD can place many demands on your time and energy, and the constant interruptions, need for repeated instruction, and close supervision can be rather exhausting. So how do you teach a learner who won't settle down and listen? Well, the answer is with a lot of patience, creativity, and consistency. As a teacher, you must remember that it is your role to evaluate each child's individual needs and strengths. Then you can develop strategies that can help your learners with ADHD to focus, to stay on task, and to learn to their full capabilities. Now, this can be achieved through getting the balance between three important elements. The first element is your classroom environment. Looking at how do you set up your classroom to assist and support learners with ADHD. Next, we'll look at your teaching and learning strategies. Are there ways that you could possibly change how you teach, how you assess, to try and facilitate the learning process for learners with ADHD? And the last element is managing the behaviour. How to successfully address this disruptive behaviour in your classroom. Let's take a look at the first element, classroom environment. So how can you set up your classroom so that it is conducive to learning for an ADHD learner? The first thing we're going to look at is seating. You must never sit an ADHD learner near a window or a door because it just provides more opportunities for the learner to become distracted by what's going on outside, any visual or auditory stimuli that they can hear. Instead, you should place the learner near the teacher. That way you can keep an eye on the learner to make sure they're staying on track and completing the. Do not place an ADHD learner in groups. This provides too many opportunities to be distracted, to talk, and to really become distracted from the task at hand. Instead, place them next to someone who is more organized and a diligent learner. The next important point is that ADHD learners need to be able to move. And so often, it is not the children that are the problem, but it is the space. So provide opportunities for learners to leave their desks and to sit on the floor and work. If they can complete the same work on the floor as they can at the desk, then allow them to move around and to maybe work in different spaces. Try have designated areas in your classroom for separated activities. So possibly a reading corner or a literacy corner, maybe a whole section dedicated to numeracy, or even just a time-out quiet area with very few distractions. Ensure that the walls are covered, but it must be for educational purposes. You don't want to put things up that are only going to distract the learner. With our designated areas, I mentioned the time-out or the quiet area, and this needs a special place where a learner can possibly reset if they're feeling a bit overwhelmed by the distractions that are happening in the classroom. They can go there, it's quiet, and they can calm down. Or an area where they do their tasks, tests, and assignments with very few distractions. Now let's look at the second element, teaching and learning strategies. So there are a few things you can do, such as when giving instructions, try and stand near the learner's desk. This will ensure that you get their attention. Make eye contact to ensure that they're focusing on what you are saying. Ensure that you give one instruction at a time. They could possibly write it down, or maybe they have a cue such as nodding their head that they have understood what you have said. And then always try and get the learner to repeat their instructions so that you know that they actually understand what needs to be done. When you are giving tasks, try ensure that the task involves some sort of a movement. So possibly during the task or at the end, they have to go and put their book in the basket or pack up the balls, but there's some goal which is a movement that they're looking forward to doing. Assist them to underline when doing tasks. Underline in the instructions what is important, what do they actually need to do, where are the key instructions. A very useful strategy is to break assignments into chunks. Often assignment will come with 4 different sets of instructions. Address the first issue first. Allow them to finish it, possibly do a movement, regroup, and then move on to the next section. These breaks in between the chunks are very important to allow the learner to release a little bit of energy and to come back and focus again. And you could possibly allow extra time for the learner to complete these activities because they have all these other demands on them, such as the need to move around, not being able to sit for a long time, not being able to focus for a long time. You want to try and make the assignment as conducive to them as possible. Other teaching tips could be to develop a subtle cue to keep the learner focused. So while you're teaching or explaining instructions to a task and you see the learner starting to daydream or wander off, you could have a subtle cue between the two of you just to bring the learner back, to draw their attention back to what you're talking about. And this could be a slight touch on the shoulder. And if this is what you decide to do, please ensure that you've asked the learner's permission to touch them before deciding on this cue. You want to use immediate positive reinforcement. This is going to be possibly your most powerful tool. You want to catch the learners doing something good. You want to reinforce them for doing even the simple things that other children can do with ease, such as sitting still for an extended amount of time. My next tip, which is brain breaks, and this is exactly what you have here on your screen. A tired learner can't focus anymore, possibly a bit bored with the work. Throw in a brain break for the whole class. And these ideas are 2 to 3 minute activities that get the learners moving, get the blood pumping, release a little bit of energy before they come down to complete a task or begin work again. This could be a game such as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where they have to find 5 pencils in the classroom, 4 posters, 3 pairs of shoes, 2 books, and 1 teddy bear. So you can make it whatever you want. Another example is Simon Says. This is a great game. Everyone stands up. Simon says, clap your hands. Simon says, sit down. And the learners have to follow your instructions. Get learners to line up. They can line up. They have to rearrange themselves from tallest to shortest, shortest to tallest, from their birth months, January to February. It doesn't matter. You can come up with anything. Musical statues is a great idea. Have a little CD player or the radio nearby and get learners moving. And movement songs such as head, shoulders, knees and toes. Seems very simple and juvenile, but work excellent for learners who just need to release a little bit of energy. So back to our teaching tips. Always try and give a warning before changing an activity. You want to maybe say 2 more minutes and then we're going to move on to the next activity, or 2 more minutes and then we're packing up for break time or for Z. Having a cue for the learner to realize that change is coming soon. And lastly, remember that learners with ADHD have a poor self-management system. So you need to design some support structure in your classroom to help the learner stay organized with their classwork and with their daily school activities. On your screen now is a traffic light, and this is an excellent idea to use in your classroom. The red stands for no talking. The yellow stands for partner talking or paired talking, so very quiet talking. And lastly, green is open talking. Everyone can talk to anyone and there is no voice or loud restriction, noise restriction. And in your classroom, you can have different activities. Some activities you put the red light on where you expect learners to be working by themselves. You could change it to the yellow light where you say, okay, in this activity, you may talk to your partner next to you, or you may discuss this in your groups. And for green, it could be, right, we are doing a very relaxed, possibly creative activity, and we're going to put music on and you can sing and talk to everyone in the class and get a positive vibe. The last element we need to look at is managing the behavior. So there are a few non-negotiables. Number 1, you need to set clear boundaries and expectations. Remember, learners with ADHD require regular reminders of classroom rules to be able to consolidate them as part of their everyday school life. Number 2, Intentional praise. Learners with ADHD deserve praise for achieving the simple things that other learners could possibly do with a lot less effort. As I mentioned earlier, such as sitting in your seat for a long time, even putting up their hand before speaking. Positive attention is powerful. You need to catch them being good. You need to reinforce the positive behavior that you are witnessing. Lastly is corrective feedback. And this is you need to give corrective feedback immediately after negative behavior has been noticed. They need to understand that this behavior is it's not acceptable, but we're going to focus on what you should do, not what you shouldn't do. Okay? And when you are giving this corrective feedback, try not be dramatic about it. State it in a matter-of-fact attitude and be brief and specific for the learners. So to sum it up, you need to set clear boundaries and you need to be consistent. You can't reprimand a learner one day for something and not do it the next day. It needs to be consistent. You need to give intentional praise. You need to reward this learner and give them positive reinforcement for their good behavior, because that's the behavior that you want to see more of. And when the negative behavior does display, you give corrective feedback. You don't focus too much on the negative, but rather what they should be doing. And you do it simple and not in a dramatic way. But now we're going to talk about what to do when disruption does happen in the classroom. And a good way to approach this is to ignore the negative behavior while you are paying attention to the class. If you had to stop teaching every time there was a disruption, you would never get through the lesson. Next, I would make sure that you are physically standing near the person who's doing the disruptive behavior. Be near them, but don't say anything. And again, maybe use that personal cue that you two have decided on. So you can put a hand on the shoulder, or possibly you just tap their desk, whatever it is that it works for the two of you. This is just a reminder to the learner that, hey, your behavior is not appropriate and you need to quieten down or focus back on the task that you're doing. So again, you have not stopped teaching the rest of the class, but you've gone and made yourself present to where they are, and hopefully your presence is enough for them to stop their negative behavior. If the learner still doesn't stop this negative or this disruptive behavior and is becoming a distraction to the rest of the class, you need to provide a distraction for the learner, because you don't want to create a whole scene in front of the rest of the class. So perhaps what you need to do is send them out on an errand or ask them to pick up the books in the corner. You physically need to get them moving and to distract them from the behavior that they were doing. And then at a later stage that you two can discuss in a matter-of-fact way what the learner did which was inappropriate and how they should have responded. So in all of this, there are a few things that you need to remember in order to boost the learner with ADHD. Try and not embarrass the learner, not in front of the class or even one other pupil. As I said, you don't want to make a dramatic scene. You want to try and distract them and stop their behavior, and then at a later stage discuss what happened and how you expect them to behave. Never say their name in a negative way, especially to them or to the rest of the class. Children are just as perceptive as adults and they can read these tones. Don't pay attention to the little stuff. You need to realize that learners with ADHD aren't trying to purposefully be disruptive, and there will be things that they do. And if you can ignore the behavior for the time being and teach the rest of the class, then do it. But remember, you always ignore the behavior, not the child. If you have an altercation with the learner, never let the learner leave angry. Try and resolve the issue, because you don't want them to hold on to it. It needs to be resolved as soon as possible. As mentioned earlier, try and focus on what behaviors you expect the learner to do, not what they are doing wrong. You don't want to focus on the negative, oh, you always do this, or you're not doing that. Focus on what you expect them to do. Don't try and force the learner to go against the grain. And what I mean by this is an ADHD learner physically cannot sit still for a long time. So if a task involves sitting for a long period of time, don't reprimand them for standing up or fidgeting or distracting the person next to them, because you should know that that is what is going to happen, and you need to make accommodations in your teaching and in your classroom for this. And lastly, please don't ever talk negatively about a learner to other teachers, because each teacher needs to make their own judgment and form their own connection and opinion about that learner. And your experience might be different to another teacher's experience with that learner. So before we end, let's look at 4 traits of successful teachers. Firstly, they are flexible. They recognize that ADHD learners are different, and they support this individuality. Secondly, they follow clear routines, and this means that they maintain a positive teaching environment. The learner knows what to expect, and the teacher knows what to expect, and in fact the whole class knows what to expect. Thirdly, they are consistent. They present information and tasks in steps. So if you are going to teach in a certain way for an ADHD learner, you need to do this all the time. If you are going to break up and assist with assignments in a certain way, then you should try and be consistent and assist in every task this way. If you've decided on a discipline method, you need to be consistent with that as well. The learner needs to know boundaries. And lastly, they are diverse. They set firm limits on student behaviour. So before we end, I have one last quote for you, and it says that most teachers and adults could benefit from pretending that all kids in their class have ADHD. What is good for kids with ADHD is good for all kids. And this is 100% true. Teachers need to make evaluations of learners and accommodate each learner in their classroom. It shouldn't only be ADHD learners that get special strategies and support. So think about that next time when you're in your classroom.